Okay, I'm just going to jump in. So, hi everyone, welcome to our first webinar in this webinar and workshop series on better vaccine conversations. We're having this series because it is clear that all over our state, Alaskans are having to tackle these really challenging conversations about the COVID-19 vaccine. We're all trying to figure out how to come back to the office or navigating childcare or planning family gatherings. And in all of these settings, talking about vaccination provokes really powerful feelings about our safety, our health, our freedom, our autonomy, and our responsibility to the communities we care for. And it's really easy for conversations like these to become really heated really quickly. Faulty assumptions, loaded words, they start to push a relationship into a destructive cycle of defensiveness and mistrust and hostility. And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today in more detail. So, when these conversations go wrong, it tears at our social fabric and it doesn't make us any safer or any healthier. So, how do we do better? Today, we're going to be focusing on understanding why it is so easy to find ourselves in a destructive cycle of conflict when we try to talk about vaccines. We think that understanding these dynamics is the first step in addressing them. And so, first, we're going to dive into a little bit of cognitive science to help us better understand why we all have a tendency to flip our lids during this kind of conversation. Then, once we understand why these conversations are so inherently difficult, we'll talk about how to decide when they're even worth the trouble. So, when to talk and when to walk. And then finally, we're going to touch on how we flip the script and pull ourselves out of that destructive cycle and into a more constructive and creative space for our conversation. So, to set your expectations appropriately, this particular webinar is really focused on understanding the problem, and it's only going to begin to frame the solution. We have this whole series of webinars and workshops that are going to be coming out. And in the workshops, we'll be practicing hands on skills. In the webinars, we'll be talking about concepts like this one. It's more about the concepts and ideas behind the skills that we're teaching. And so we're hoping that this first webinar whets your appetite for some of those. All of the webinars are going to be recorded, and so you'll have the chance to view them even if you can't attend the lunch and learns. Then we'll be having hands-on workshops that will take place in the evenings, and we have at least one, I think possibly two, that are planned for weekend dates, and those are going to be focused on practicing skills. Those won't be recorded. Those will be a little bit more. They'll be limited to the number of seats so that we can really dig in together, and nobody has to worry about anything that they do in the session being shared with the wider world. You can practice and you can make mistakes and not have to worry about that being posted anywhere online or anything. And let's see here. So for this webinar, we are going to save time for a Q&A at the end, and we will send out the slides as well as the recorded presentation to everyone here. We will make that recording available. So if you want to share it with other people, you'll have the recording available for that purpose. And finally, we'll share some more information when we follow up about how to sign up for the future workshops and webinars. So with that, let's jump in. So the Alaska Humanities Forum has developed this series in partnership with the Alaska Children's Trust with funding from United Way and the municipality of Anchorage's health department. Quick caveat, The opinions, findings, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the Alaska Humanities Forum. They do not necessarily reflect the views of United Way of Anchorage or of the Municipality of Anchorage's Health Department. So that you have a little bit of background on who we are and how we think about the work we do in the community, I want to share a short video to give you a little bit of context about the Alaska Humanities Forum.
The world is so fast-paced now that there's not a lot of space to just sit and actually listen.
The problems that we face aren't simple. They're layered, they're nuanced.
We get into silos of people who think like us.
And that's what we often ignore. We try to solve problems in a technical way. We try to work around humans and tackle really complex issues. But at the heart of the issue and at the heart of the solution is people. One of the ways that we can build community is through stories. And at the Humanities Forum, what we do with those stories is we use them as our tool. The tool to connect people, a tool to bridge differences. If you really want to strengthen communities, you have to tackle relationships. We play the role of convening, creating that space.
A place where people and ideas could come together.
To talk about and work on the issues that are most important in our community.
Conversations that are actually thought-provoking and that matter.
Imagine if we could work through those things.
The value is bringing such diversity together.
Share values or views of the world.
If you step away from what you think you're supposed to say in a conversation,
you just can't help but have your ideas be influenced and informed by other people's ideas.
open up your mind, and that's how you really connect with people.
It opens us up to be interested in why people are the way they are.
Shared experiences create relationships. And those relationships are what solutions are built on.
And relationships aren't something short-term.
You cannot make community in a single quarter of a single year.
Our work is all about the long game.
I think that's really what's going to change our communities.
It sounds soft, but it's not.
It changes the path to what's possible.
It's the work that can actually change societies.
You start to think about future generations and what their experience is going to be.
We have the opportunity now to change history. We do, and I think we're going to do it.
Then let's have a conversation. What do we want to build?
Okay, so thank you for taking a moment to watch that with me. So to give you a little bit of context about me, my name is Megan Cassiola, and I am the Vice President of Programs at the Forum. I'm here with my colleague Odd Plez, who is our workshop coordinator, and you've likely received emails from them in order to access this webinar. So we're going to be the ones managing this whole series. So you'll get to know us if you come to future events as well. And Odd and I acknowledge that we are facilitating this webinar from Jayatnu, Anchorage, the current and ancestral homelands of the Dena'ina people. This image is a photo of the Grandma Olga statue that's at the small boat harbor, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump from our offices at the train station. If you haven't had a chance to check out this statue, it's by Joel Isaac, and it's in this really beautiful spot overlooking Cook Inlet. And there's a lot of signs about about Ship Creek and its long history here in the region. So I've already outlined the goals of the workshop when we were talking about the agenda. But just to orient you again, we're going to start by getting into a little bit of neuroscience and exploring why we flip our lids when we're in conflict. So in Alaska, we all each have a bear story of some kind, whether it's one we personally experienced or a friend or family member. And we all know that when we encounter a real physical threat like a bear out in the wild, that our brain is naturally inclined to jump into its survival drive. And our survival instinct is to either fight, flee, or freeze. We all learned about that in school. And so, what's the connection between a bear encounter and a conversation about vaccines? Well, the fact is that our lower brain still treats the threatening beliefs that we might encounter in a vaccine conversation the same way we might with a threatening bear. And so we respond in the same way with either a desire to fight, flee, or freeze. What does that look like in a conversational setting as opposed to out in our on a hike or in our backyards if we encounter a bear? Well, with a fight, what we do is we argue aggressively to win the argument, and we start to really focus on the idea that we're going to one up the other person or we're going to put them down in some way in order to show that their beliefs are incorrect or wrong or ignorant. When we flee, we either avoid or give up the conversation altogether. And we may end up retreating into the groups of people that we feel are more inclined to believe the same way that we do. And so we just push ourselves out of the conversation altogether. And then the final reaction that we tend to have is freezing. So dumbstruck, we fail to respond at all. What this looks like is that, I think that we've probably all had an experience in COVID and in all sorts of conflict conversations that we've had in our lives where somebody says something and we just don't even address it. We just let it go because we don't know how to respond or we don't know how to respond in a way that we think is going to be productive or constructive. And so we just try to move on. It's not quite the same as avoiding because we might stay in the conversation with the person, but we just let them talk without really responding and sharing our own beliefs and convictions ourselves. So I'm going to share another video. This is one by Ken Beer, who has a book called Difficult Conversations, which is a really, really great one. It's short. You can read it probably in a day. And it provides a lot of the background for this particular webinar. And so I'll let him talk about the science behind flipping our lids.
Most of us probably could sort of, prescribe for you what a good conversation is composed of, but we find it difficult to follow. Can you just share with us a little bit about why that is?
So one thing that's really helpful to know is, and this is what's really interesting in the studies of neuroscience, is that threats to our ideas, threats to our beliefs, trigger the exact same survival drive as if we were being physically threatened. So what I'm going to do is just quickly share something. If there was one takeaway from this time together, this is going to be it. So this is what people are going to want to pay attention to. Okay, this is it. What I'd like you to do is join me in holding up your hand like this. Okay. And if you look at your wrist coming up into the palm, the wrist is the spinal cord coming up into the base of the brain. And the base of the brain is your palm, right? So that is That is sometimes called the reptilian brain. It's the oldest part of the brain. And it's responsible for all our autonomic uh, uh, processes, such as breathing and heart rate and blood pressure. Takes care of all of those things that we don't have to think about, right? We don't have to remember to breathe, we just breathe. So we're very grateful for this reptilian brain right there. It's also the part of the brain that registers threats. So that's a really important thing to know. It registers threats, this very ancient part of the brain. So then you take your thumb and you cross it over across the palm. That represents your midbrain or your limbic system, sometimes called the feeling brain or the emotional brain. And when our survival drive is triggered, it's really the reptilian brain and the limbic system that are working together to create that fight, flight, freeze response that is typical of our survival drive. So you might be thinking now in a difficult conversation, what is fight, flight, freeze? Well, we fight by arguing to win, for example, that would be a fight. We would flee by avoiding the conversation altogether. You just don't want to have it. Or sometimes we freeze. Sometimes someone says something that just so stuns us. We just can't even believe they said what they just said. We actually can't muster any kind of response at all. So that is controlled by the lower part of our brain. So then you fold your fingers over the top, and the fingers represent your neocortex, the newest part of your brain. So the orientation is like this. This is the front of your head. The back of your hand is the back of your head. So what happens is that one of the functions of the neocortex is to actually monitor that fight, flee, freeze reaction and to attenuate it if it's inappropriately activated. But if our survival drive is triggered, we do something called, we flip our lid like this. And so we've actually lost the neural connection between the older part of our brain and the newer part of our brain. And we have lost the ability, to stay calm. We have lost the ability for reflective thought, for moral reasoning, for self-knowing awareness, even for intuition. All of that becomes lost to us when our survival drive is triggered. So one thing we want to be able to do is that we're in that state, is actually reconnect our brain so that we can be calm and we can be present.
Okay, so Beer was talking about this idea of flipping our lids, and it's also a model that comes up a lot if you work with toddlers, because toddlers are known to flip their lids a lot as well. Their reaction becomes really focused on just that survival drive in reaction to anything. That's what a temper tantrum is. And so, how do you help the child to reconnect to the part of their brain that can help them modulate their response? A lot of those strategies are the same strategies that you would use to think about your own reaction. And the reality is that when we're in conflict, a lot of times both parties or all of the parties involved in the conversation are all in some ways flipping their lids, where we're no longer able to empathize. We may not have the same ability um, to be compassionate, or to even have a sense of our moral reasoning, a connection to our moral reasoning priorities and so forth. Okay, so the destructive cycle of conflict happens because we have this threat, and then we go into that survival mode. We flip our lids. And part of what happens when we flip our lids is that we become vigilant for other threats. Is all we are able to focus on ourselves is looking for threats. And when you have that lens on the conversation, on what is happening around you, you are going to see threats. You're going to interpret things that you hear in the conversation that the other person says. You're going to hear them as threatening, even if they wouldn't in another context actually feel that way. And that other person is going to do the same thing. They're going to experience a lot of the things that you may even be saying without a threatening intention or a, or even any sort of, that may not be on your mind at all. And yet it's going to be perceived that way because the lens that we're looking through is that threat lens. Everything that we're looking for, scanning our environment for, listening to, we're looking for threats. And when you look for them, you find them. So we just get caught in this loop. And once that loop is set in motion and it starts to repeat, it becomes really, really resistant to change. And so that's, why we tend to just get so fed up that we stop wanting to engage in these conversations altogether. Okay, so one of the pieces of pushback that a person might give here is that when our health is at stake, isn't our instinctive survival drive appropriate? Isn't this a do or die situation? And that may be, but the question is not whether it's an appropriate, rational, or justifiable response. The question is whether it's an effective response. And in the case of a conversation about vaccines, fighting, fleeing, and freezing are not going to be effective responses. They, as we've all experienced, have the tendency to tear our community apart rather than bringing us together. They don't make us, that kind of conversation doesn't make us healthier or safer, and it sacrifices our relationships. So, second goal of this workshop is to understand when to lean into the conflict and when to walk away. When do we talk and when do we walk? We understand that this is a really challenging conversation space, that we are all going to have difficulty maintaining our cool in the face of this kind of conversation. So when is it worth the trouble to dig in and have the conversation anyway? Here's where I want to just admit that there's no magic solutions for abusive and aggressive strangers. In the pandemic, we've either experienced or we've read about really aggressive behaviors that have started to arise in public encounters between people who are doing their jobs or just strangers in public. And when you have an encounter like that, conversation is probably not going to be effective. I would say that there are trainings that are supportive of like mental health crisis responses and things like that, and those techniques are probably more appropriate than good conversation techniques. Conversation is a tool for being in and staying in a relationship with somebody. And when you are not in a relationship with somebody yet, and they are already being aggressive and abusive towards you, you're probably not in a place to try to build a relationship. So my advice here is just to remember when these things happen, it's not really about you. And you do your best. And this is probably not the space where you're going to be making a lot of change or influencing someone. Our relationships, on the other hand, are our greatest sources of influence. And so when it's worth it is when you actually want to stay in relationship. And so when are those times? So one of the reasons might be that it's your job. And so healthcare professionals, people who are supervisors with in offices or workplaces with vaccine mandates, policymakers and elected officials, all of those people, part of their job description right now is having vaccine conversations. And so it's not really something you can opt out of in those cases. When your relationship matters with someone, it is probably worthwhile to try to have a conversation about vaccines, even if it's difficult. And so that means family members, coworkers, parents of your children's friends, your own friends. These are people who you are in relationship with and who you are likely to stay in relationship with, who you have reasons to want to make things work. And so when your relationship matters, these kind of conversations matter. And then finally, the last thing is when you have the time to have the conversations. And so again, you're going to be talking to this person again. You can play the long game. These are spaces where people have really, really strong convictions. And to the extent that you want to influence their point of view, it's probably not going to happen in 5 minutes or even an hour. It's probably going to happen over weeks or months or longer. And so having that long game, that long time frame in mind can really help to make the outcomes of any particular conversation a lot lower stakes. And then the last thing is you can pause or slow down when you need to. If you can't pause or slow down when you need to, it's not a really good time. It's not a really good relationship to be trying to have the conversation because these are heated spaces, because we are likely to flip our lids and we need to find the time and the space to actually calm ourselves down and step back and take a different approach. Okay. So we know when we might even put strategies into use to try to make the conversations better. But how do we do that? How do we actually flip the script? We're in this destructive cycle. How do we get out of it and get to a better place? Well, when we're in that destructive cycle of conflict, a lot of times we need to pause and step back to reconsider the purpose of our conversation. And we need to flip the script by shifting our goals about what the conversation is all about. And here's the key. Make sure that your goal is something that the other person would actually sign on for. If your goal is to change their mind, they're not going to sign on for that. They believe in what they believe. And so, what is a goal that you could have for the conversation that can make you into partners in achieving that goal rather than antagonists who are each contrary to one another's goals? So the first thing to think about is prioritizing the relationship. So maybe your goal is just sustaining the relationship in the face of articulated disagreement. And so that is something that the other person might sign on for. Sustaining the relationship, even in the face of articulated disagreement. And this is where we prioritize connection before conviction. One of the biggest barriers to putting connection first above conviction is a tendency we have, particularly lately, to approach empathy almost as if it were an endorsement of the other person's position. If you believe that empathizing with a person means endorsing their choices and behaviors, it's going to be really, really hard to listen to them and empathize with them. But if you can if you can come to the conclusion that you can empathize with somebody, you can have compassion for them while still really strongly disagreeing with them, while still believing that their choices are not the right ones, then you can prioritize the connection, even in the face of your conviction. And we'll get into why you would want to have connections with people who believe so differently than you. But the first thing here, in terms of flipping the script on the conversation, is prioritizing that relationship. You're doing this in the context of generally relationships that matter for some reason. And so prioritizing the relationship makes sense then. But even when it's just your job to have the conversation, prioritizing the relationship can have benefits. And we'll talk about that why shortly. Another goal that you might have that you could both agree to would be to find out, to learn the unspoken story behind their beliefs. And so they believe something really different than you. And a lot of times when a person has a certain set of beliefs, we immediately have a story for them about how they came to those beliefs. And this is particularly true with vaccination. We have heard a lot of things in the media and on the news about why different people come to certain conclusions about whether to be vaccinated or not. And so often when we learn that somebody is vaccinated or is not vaccinated, believes one thing about vaccination or not, we immediately tell ourselves a story about them and a lot of things about their life, which may or may not be true. And so if one of our goals in the conversation is to really understand what their story is and try to find out what might surprise us, if we're seeking those pieces that, maybe we wouldn't have expected, then we can shift ourselves to a space of being curious rather than judgmental. And so we're checking all of our assumptions with questions, and hopefully open-ended questions, because if a question is really targeted, it can sometimes feel judgmental. So if we try to push ourselves into a space of curiosity, we can keep a sense of openness from them and just learn about one another. And then the last goal that might be something that both people would sign on for is seeking out the weaknesses in your own point of view. So we're all subject to the same cognitive biases. And, no matter our level of expertise in this subject area, there is somewhere where we are relying on the knowledge of others and our assessments of expertise and so forth. A virologist is not an expert in epidemiology. An epidemiologist is not an expert in virology. A virologist is not an expert in how policy gets made and enacted and how politics function. And so there are all spaces where we are stretching ourselves in our understanding. And so if instead of seeking out the weaknesses in the other person's point of view, we use the conversation as an opportunity to really listen to ourselves and figure out, like, where don't I have all of the answers? Like, where are the weaknesses here? The conversation can be a sort of mirror to allow you to reflect on what you know and what you really don't know, and where you might be thinking that something is based on a fact, but it's really based on values, or vice versa. But all that being said, a lot of times, really, at the end of the day, we all care about actually making change in the world. And so we want to see some of the things that, some of the wide range changes we want to see in our communities. We recognize that the fact that there's large scale disagreement about vaccines, that is something that is tearing us apart. So we want to influence. Aren't my relationships the source of influence? Isn't that what, I said on that one slide a little bit ago, that our relationships are our greatest source of influence? So what's the point if I'm not trying to influence them? So the thing is that counterintuitively, we have to let go of control in order to be influential. Um, One of the things that we know about influence through many studies, and I can follow up with more details about where this comes from, uh, is that when you are trying to convince somebody of a particular point of view, when you are trying to change their mind, that person feels like you are trying to control them. And vice versa. If the other person is trying to change your mind, you feel like they are trying to control you. When you let go of the attachment to a specific outcome, like them agreeing with you, for example, then the other person in the conversation begins to feel a greater sense of agency, and they feel like they are being trusted by you. And when a person feels trusted, and when they feel like they have a greater sense of agency, when they have choices for themselves, they're more open and receptive to ideas. And so by not trying to influence, you will counterintuitively likely actually be more influential over the long term. So the thing is that when you are detached from that specific outcome, that doesn't mean that you're disinterested, that you don't have an interest in this outcome of influencing somebody. It's important that you actually articulate your convictions and values when you have the opportunity to, and that you make the case for what you believe in. If you don't, it's really almost the same as freezing in this situation. And it's not really a conversation. It is you getting information. It's essentially a presentation to you if you don't reciprocate and articulate your own beliefs. But again, you can shift the purpose of that articulation and change the dynamics in terms of the conflict if you just slightly shift your goal with that sharing. So you can share your perspective as a way of helping the other person get to know you better. And so you're not necessarily focused on changing their mind. You're just really focused on sharing some things about you that you really care about, just like you might tell stories about your children or about your vacation to another country. You're not sharing it to try to convince the other person about anything. You're just sharing things that you care about. And when you shift the purpose, it'll shift the way that the other person experiences the conversation. They won't feel like you're trying to control them as much. They will feel like you're just sharing part of yourself. The other purpose behind articulating your convictions and values is that mirror purpose. So you can use the opportunity to better understand your own beliefs, your own story, and figure out how to express your thoughts as clearly as possible. So you're almost using your conversational partner, the person you're in conversation with, as a thought partner to help you figure out, what do I need to express more clearly? What's still unclear even for me? And then it's not necessarily a threat that the person doesn't understand what you're saying. It is feedback that helps you say, I need to figure out a better way of putting this into words. What are some other words? What's a different metaphor? What's a story I could tell that might help this person better understand where I'm coming from? And you might surprise yourself and learn something about yourself that you didn't realize before through that conversation. So, hopefully, over the course of this webinar, we've understood why we flip our lids. We've started thinking about when it's appropriate to actually have these conversations and when it might not be worth it. And then we've started to see some ways that we might be able to flip the script by shifting our goals. Now, that last part is pretty difficult because if we flipped our lids, then it's hard to step back and actually reframe our perspective and ask curious questions, place questions from a place of genuine curiosity as opposed to questions that are trying to, catch the person in something that might make them see that they're wrong. Those things are hard. And that's why we have the rest of the webinar and workshop series. We're going to be practicing some of those skills and seeing how they feel in practice. But for now, I hope that I have made the case that maybe stepping back from that goal of influence might actually, in the long run, help us to be more influential with one another. The reality is, though, that by stepping back and focusing on other things in the conversation, you may end up opening yourself to being influenced yourself. And again, counterintuitively, by opening ourselves to being influenced, we end up exerting more influence over others or having the opportunity to. And so we may end up in a surprising place if we do that. We may not end up influencing in the ways that we expect, and we may not end up with the same beliefs that we thought we started with. That's how community works, that our relationships take us in unexpected places. So, like I said, we're going to be having a lot of workshops over the next few months. Here is a list. There are 2 series that are sort of going hand in hand. One is our webinar series, which will all be lunch and learn style like this one. It will be a lunch and learn with a Q&A to follow. And then the other are these skill-based workshops that are going to be more hands-on, smaller, more interactive. And all of the webinars are going to be recorded and posted. The workshops, though, will not be, although if you miss one, I'm sure that we would be happy to share the slides and information and chat with you about what you missed in case, at the very least, that would be helpful. And we will share this with all of you in the follow-up email so that you have access to it along with information about how to sign up. We're in the process of getting all of these on our website so that you can register. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to a Q&A. And 2 things that I ask. One is that when you are sharing a question, you share your name, your community. So these webinars can be, because they're virtual, can be attended from all over Alaska. We'd love to hear where you're located. And then share your question. The final thing is that we want you to be aware that there may be a wide range of perspectives on vaccination in the room, and we want you to be respectful. A lot of times in webinars like these, our questions can make the assumption that everyone here believes the same things. That may not be the case, so we ask that you consider that when framing your question. I'll hand it off to Odd, who's going to be managing the Q&A. Odd, do you have any instructions for everyone?
Yeah, so I have 2 things, just to make sure that we can make sure that we're holding space for each other's voices. At the bottom of your toolbar for Zoom, there's a reaction where you can raise your hand. And so if you do want to speak, if you don't feel comfortable jumping in, I encourage you to do such by raising your hand. The other thing that you can do is also place comments into the chat, which I'm also monitoring. For example, Heather had put a few moments ago, I like that the emphasis is not shifting your goal as a way, I'm gonna believe you meant to, a way to win. So, but yeah, if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask, be my guest.
Well, since I don't know whether anybody's going to have a question, I'll just go ahead and leave up this slide. I'll still be here. If anybody has a question, you're welcome to jump in, but this slide might be more useful for if you're not thinking of a question right now.
Yeah, Andrea, unless it's Andrea, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please be my guest.
If so not specifically, but there is space to potentially do some customization if I know a little bit more about the context and the need. So what I would encourage is if you would follow up with me and Odd and let me know what you're thinking, what you think would be really, really useful. We can put our heads together and see what might be possible.
Lisa, I see that your hand is up. If you want to go ahead and unmute to ask your question.
Sure. It's sometimes helpful. I mean, I know this is all in the context of the vaccine conversation, but maybe to just give us an example of a back and forth and how you envision we could be talking differently than we might be inclined to speak on one side of that question or another. And of course, there's a spectrum, so there's a great middle ground as well. So, could you give us kind of a sample dialogue?
I think that this is the sort of thing where when we have more space in the workshops, there'll definitely be time for that. But I think that to give an example off the top of my head, I think that one tendency in this kind of conversation is to start going back and forth with facts or with what people see as data that supports their point of view related to vaccination or the reasons why you might not get vaccinated or like what is going to be productive in our communities, what's going to bring us together versus tear us apart. And so a lot of times people will rely on these stories rather than, and what you get is one person sharing their fact and the other person saying, no, here's my fact. And then another person saying, but here's this fact that I believe. And then this person says, no, this is my fact. And if we can shift to getting curious, and so some of the questions that might help to shift into a space of curiosity rather than a place of just trying to prove my point of view would be a question like, tell me a little bit more about why that means so much to you, or like what are some things that you've experienced that have led, like one thing that you might do is listen for a value, an underlying value that the person has. And so like, for instance, a lot of times everybody's talking about, health and safety. And one person might be concerned about their health because of the vaccine. And another person might be concerned about their health and therefore get the vaccine. And so then you could say, I hear that it sounds like you're really concerned about health here. And I want to understand more about what makes you more scared of the vaccine than of the virus. Like, what do you think is, where do you think that stems from? And try to elicit their story for that, as opposed to just pushing back on their reasons. Does that help to give an example there? Maybe a little. Another example is that I think that sometimes one person is talking about autonomy and freedom and that sort of thing, and another person is talking about uh, some of the things in terms of like community care and caring for one another by showing that you're going to do things on behalf of the common good. And so again, even when your values are different, you can share, like, I hear that you are saying that this is something that's really important to you. Where do you think that comes from? Why, like, what who taught you to value that? Like, who in your life has taught you that that's important? And it can be that very same question can sound fake if it's not coming from a place of sincere curiosity. So you kind of have to shift yourself and actually be thinking, like, I could be surprised by the person's answer, and you have to really get yourself to be curious in order for the question to come across appropriately, because otherwise it can kind of sound like, well, why would you think that? Which is not the best or most productive approach.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up question or? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Heather, I see that you have your hand up, so if you want to unmute and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Heather Foxworthy. I'm calling in from Kodiak today. I really appreciate that today's information is useful for basically any topic and not just for conversations on vaccinations. It's like a basic life skill I think we have forgotten how to teach. So I really do appreciate you've presented this in a very neutral, useful to any situation. So thank you for that. I was wondering if the rest of these are going to keep the neutral balance, or do we have an end goal of, I don't know, increasing vaccination rates or helping people to see they need one? I mean, what is the end goal, or are they all going to be this nice and neutral?
So this particular series is meant to be neutral, and the idea is that fundamentally, I guess for transparency's sake, it is funded by an effort to increase the vaccination rate. But this particular series is one that recognizes that destructive conflict in vaccine conversations is just bad for our communities, generally speaking. And so the purpose is not to, in this workshop, change anybody's mind in any of these webinars or workshops. The purpose is to improve the ecosystem of conversation. And I think that regardless of a person's perspective, the idea is that, I guess, the arc will bend towards the right thing. And if you believe that it's one thing, then you got to have faith that a good ecosystem of conversation is going to turn out the way you want it to. And if you believe another thing, you got to believe that. But the truth of the matter is, just like I was saying at the end, in order to be influential, you have to open yourself to being influenced. And so you might end up in a surprising place. all of us. But the answer is yes, it will stay neutral.
Great, thank you. That answers it.
And then I see that, and then Andrew, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'd be interested in a workshop about building support for setting institutional policy. Is the comment that's placed in the chat.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? While you all are thinking about any final questions, I'm going to share just a quick one question, brief satisfaction survey that will help us assess this. We are working on a more developed survey for these workshops, and we will be emailing all of you a follow-up once that survey is developed. And we would love to get your thoughts in more detail once we have them. This is just giving us a brief temperature check so that we can keep working on the series as we go. So we appreciate it, and we'll be here for the next 5 minutes while we wait for more questions.
And then it looks like Lily put in Fawn from Gnome. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions for fact sheets that would go with these conversations?
So one of the things that we'll talk about in more detail in a future webinar and workshop is the way that facts are rarely useful in changing somebody's mind. They are often useful when somebody is undecided. And so I think that my best tip with that is thinking strategically about when fact sheets are helpful and appropriate and when they are probably not actually going to move the conversation forward. And so if somebody is curious, a fact sheet can be really helpful because they're sort of seeking information and they feel like they don't have enough. In those cases, another thing that is helpful is being really upfront about what you know and what you don't know. And there's a lot of information out there about clear communication. The classic example is the "we have no evidence that" is often misinterpreted to mean we have evidence against. When a scientist says we have no evidence that, they really tend to mean that there's like we just don't know. But the public tends to hear that as we have evidence against something. And so being aware of those things when presenting your facts can be helpful to simultaneously share the things that you don't know, but not mislead people and make them think that we actually know something more than we do. I don't know if that's a helpful part of the question, but the biggest thing in terms of this series is that a lot of the time a fact sheet is not going to be a productive thing. There's specific cases in which it will be.
Well, I'm going to acknowledge I don't see anyone else raising their hand, nor are there any additional comments in the chat.
Okay. Well, I think that that's time then. So thank you, everyone. We hope to see some of you back at future webinars and workshops. Aud and I will be following up, and please feel free to share comments, concerns, questions, follow-up. We are really eager to get feedback about this series and the plan and how it's going so far. So anything you have to share, positive, negative, constructive, we're into hearing it. So thank you.